Winter, she's the Associate Dean of Research, Global Information Studies, Co-Director of the Center for Advanced Study of Communities Information at the University of Maryland. Next to her, we have Craig C. Brookins. He's our coordinator of Africana Studies Program in the Department of Psychology here at NC State. He's also the 1718 Engagement Scholarship Fellow here at NC State. And to my immediate left, we have David Resnik. He's the Bioethicist and IRP Chair at the National Institutes for Environmental Health Services at the National Institutes of Health. I'm going to pass the mic off to them. They're going to talk a little bit about their research relevant, or their work and research relevant to the subject matter of the panel. Once again, the panel is opportunities and obstacles for engaged scholarship. And after they do their pre-presentations, we open it up for a whole set of questions. David Resnik.
Good morning. It's good to be here. So I'm just going to make a few brief comments and then pass on the mic, and then I guess we'll have a discussion after that. So innovations in STEM fields often pose ethical dilemmas for society. For example, new genome editing techniques pose ethical questions concerning responsible use of those techniques in microorganisms, plants, animals, and humans. Should we genetically modify plants for use in agriculture? What sorts of risks and benefits do genetic modifications create for public health and the environment? Is it acceptable to release genetically modified organisms into the environment? For example, GM mosquitoes, corn, grass. How can these organisms be controlled? What about using gene drive mechanisms in populations? Is it acceptable to use gene editing to treat diseases in patients, to prevent children from being born with diseases, to create genetically enhanced people? Many of these questions have been addressed in the past. In fact, these have all been anticipated for several decades, and we've been debating about genetic engineering since at least the 1970s with the advent of recombinant DNA technology. But the new technologies make it easier to create genetically modified organisms and increase the range of possibilities that in years past were in the realm of science fiction, but they're fast becoming in the realm of science fact today. Other areas of innovation also pose ethical dilemmas. Just a list of things besides genetic engineering: synthetic biology, gene therapy, genetic testing, stem cell therapy, cloning, development of pharmaceuticals, biologics, medical devices, assisted reproduction, the use of drones, information technology, computing, artificial intelligence, robotics, geoengineering, nanotechnology, to name but a few. So these conflicts, these innovations often create conflicts among fundamental values, such as human rights and dignity, privacy, public health, safety, environmental protection, economic development, and social justice. For example, releasing genetically modified mosquitoes into the environment may help to prevent diseases, but it could pose some risks for human beings as well as also risks for the environment. Genetically modified crops can be good for agriculture and promoting health by feeding people, and also good for the economy, but may be risks for human health as well as the environment. The use of genetic tests to treat or prevent diseases can promote human health, but may threaten privacy and lead to discrimination. Gene editing of human embryos can promote health and respect the reproductive rights of parents, but it raises concerns about the risks to the unborn as well as future generations, and also issues of discrimination and social justice. Ethics and the law often lag behind science and technology. Innovation usually happens before we have a chance to think clearly about responsible development, and the use of those innovations create and to create ethical frameworks for ethical and legal oversight for those innovations. It is incumbent upon scientists, engineers, technologists, business leaders, and other innovators to anticipate some of these issues that may arise and to engage the public in honest, open, informative, and respectful debates concerning the possible uses of STEM innovations and their likely benefits and risks. Engagement should include those with a stake in the issue, especially members of communities directly impacted by the technology. For example, if you're going to release genetically modified mosquitoes in a particular area of the world, it would be a good idea to ask people living there whether they want GM mosquitoes to be in the vicinity, whoever's going to be directly impacted. Innovators should resist the temptation to overhype the possible benefits of new developments, which unfortunately happens way too much, as we've seen with, the cure for cancer announced, or gene therapy is going to fix all our problems, or whatever. We hear people hyping technology. That's a danger. Also, it's important for innovators not to dismiss public concerns as unreasonable or irrational or ill-informed. And I mean, they may be ill-informed, but very often the public has some real concerns that innovators need to pay careful attention to. So that's all I have, and I'll pass on the mic. Thank you.
Good morning. With no response. Good morning. Good morning. All right. Tracy Brookins is the name. I'm thrilled to be here. This opportunity to participate in what I think is a very important event. I haven't attended much, but having taken a look at the abstracts from the panels, the workshops, as well as the posters, I'm encouraged. What I'm here to talk about is engagement scholarship, and particularly engagement scholarship as it takes place here at North Carolina State University, and more broadly, I think. We are, as an engagement scholarship fellow, I'm working with our university outreach and engagement office, and one of my roles, broadly speaking, is to help grow the culture of engagement, and more specifically, the culture of engagement scholarship. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Definitions of engagement scholarship or community engagement are not necessarily the same, and often are not well understood. So I'm going to provide a couple of distinctions or definitions, if you will. We have taken a look at the landscape of engagement scholarship across the country. Some universities and, of course, researchers and scholars are doing it well, but some of it is also very challenged as we try to create institutions, particularly universities, that are more proactively, deliberately, and purposefully engaged with the communities that they work with. Community engagement can be understood as traditional outreach, where knowledge and expertise that exists within a university is applied or otherwise brought to communities, and yes, to help solve problems that may exist in communities. The scholarship of engagement, however, is a collaborative, let me define it. The scholarship of engagement is the collaborative generation, refinement, conservation, and exchange of mutually beneficial and societally relevant knowledge that is communicated to and validated by peers in academia and the community. So that's a bit of an official definition that we'll use. And I want to hone in on that point of collaboratives, right? So for me, the collaborative generation of knowledge is embedded within that definition, speaks to the necessity of mutual and reciprocal creation of knowledge. Something that I think as scholars, as researchers, as faculty members who have a particular expertise often do not appreciate as much as I think we can. And it's about the creation of knowledge and valuing the knowledge that exists in all communities. Engagement scholarship must also begin to focus on as much on enhancing the strengths of community and ideally less on solving problems that we see. So building on the strengths as opposed to just focusing on the problems. I have more recently worked on a few collaborative processes, and I think the collaboration includes not just collaborating with communities, but also collaborating with colleagues across disciplinary areas, so interdisciplinary work. And particularly in a context where we are asked to focus on what are called grand challenges, then that certainly requires a kind of interdisciplinary approach, not a kind of interdisciplinary approach, but an interdisciplinary approach. And if we have time, I want to talk about some of my recent experiences working with colleagues across disciplinary areas. I am a community psychologist by training, and the opportunity, this panel in particular about opportunities and challenges of working across interdisciplinary areas, particularly with folks in the sciences and STEM and other behavior and social sciences, I think is an important one. The purpose, the Scholarship of Engagement, aims to develop ethical and practical solutions to social, health, economic, and environmental issues. The scholarship may involve higher education institutions and communities on and off campus in partnerships that hold common goals and share expertise and resources. The scholarship serves to integrate learning, discovery, and engagement. An area or in STEM areas, engaged scholarship can often best be captured through research that focuses on broader impacts. I believe NSF, for instance, requires that most proposals these days and work that researchers do have a very clear idea of what the broader impacts of that work is. Broader impacts defined as a process with people/stakeholders, this is a definition, to achieve a societal benefit in a finite time that is measured. This can be through one's teaching, research, service, and occupation. It can be broader impacts on almost anything if done appropriately. Broader impacts can lead to sustainable, positive impacts. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about opportunities, particularly for community-engaged scholarship here at NC State and in general at land-grant universities. There are many and speak to the importance of the engagement mission. Obstacles relate primarily to the degree to which an institution supports engagement scholarship via support, incentivization, and tenure and promotion policies for faculty doing this work. That has not always been the case. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are working hard to develop a culture of engagement that involves incentivization, how faculty who are coming in doing this work can be fairly evaluated, particularly those who are going towards tenure and promotion, and the types of support we can provide to help people get there. NC State has, in fact, been a national leader, which many do not know, in engagement scholarship and the scholarship of engagement. Since 1999 to about 2006, there was a very robust effort here to begin building that on that culture on this campus. Since 2006, we have lost a little momentum, but are trying to regenerate that momentum again to support faculty in their teaching engagement scholarship, and other areas as well. We are a voluntary, we are a Carnegie engaged institution. It's a voluntary designation, and we're one of the prime participants in the creation of what is called a national organization called the Engagement Scholarship Consortium. So engagement, just like extension, is in the DNA of NC State University and most land-grant institutions, but it extends beyond extension, and it extends beyond outreach, and it does get to the co-creation of knowledge. So I look forward to talking about more of that as we move forward. And for those of you who may be here at NC State, how we can continue to build cohorts and involve you all as well in our efforts to build a culture of engagement scholarship. Thank you.
I'm Susan Winter from the University of Maryland. And as I said yesterday, I'm actually come from the sort of organizational scholarship side of this. And I tend to go very macro. I think I'll echo some of the things that Craig was mentioning. I look at this as an innovation ecosystem, and I look at it in terms of its institutional, contextual, historical roots. What we're really looking at, when we look at scholarship in context, is a system that was set up during and just after the Cold War, where government strongly influenced the research that was being done. That didn't happen in the 1800s. This happened after the Cold War. You look at the act that created the National Science Foundation. That was a 1950 act. The National Institutes of Health. These were all set up in a way that reinforces the idea that scientists decide what to study and how to study it. The money gets appropriated from Congress. It gets appropriated from the state legislatures. It supports research. I was struck yesterday with Pat's comments that industry didn't want interference in what researchers got to research. They wanted the market to be able to operate. And I thought, this is not a free market. What makes you think this is a free market when you've got billions and billions of dollars from the government, yes, picking winners and losers? When you've got the government able to say, no, we're going to ban research on embryonic stem cells. No, we're not going to have any more climate change research. This is not a market that is operating freely. Universities have done a marvelous job of then reacting to a market in which efficient publication leads to tenure and improves your university rankings. This is not a recipe for encouraging engaged scholarship. However, things are changing. Things are changing. They've been changing since the end of the Cold War. And I'm seeing some things coming to fruition that we never thought we were going to see, couldn't have predicted 40 years ago. Society actually wants academics to solve problems. This is very different from go off and do your research, that's a great idea, be as creative as possible. They're actually saying, we've been spending a lot of money on you, and we have some problems, can't you help us solve some of them? At the moment, they're very focused on solving the problems that are related to the economy, not structural problems in the economy. They want economic growth. They want researchers to patent things that will be taken to market and provide economic growth, and they want national security. That could change, though. And we're seeing a decrease in money going to higher education. States, we're looking at places like the University of Michigan. They get, what, 6% of their budget from the state? These are state institutions that don't get money from the state. This is incredible. All the R1s are looking at this saying that they can't run the institution on the money that the state gives them. States are spending less and less money on universities. You can actually watch the trends over time. The percentage goes down in terms of money to the universities in almost the same proportion as the monies go up for prisons. It's really quite phenomenal. We're also seeing only about 2/3 of the positions in academia are tenure track. Now, tenure only got created in many parts of the US after the Cold War. So the UC system was put in the 1950s, 1960s in the state system. We're seeing the percentage of non-tenure track rising. I actually think we're going to see tenure disappear. And that's a pretty strong statement to make, but if you look at what's happening in Europe and what's happening in Australia with research assessment exercises, where you actually have to show the economic impact of your faculty member in order to give them a permanent contract or a semi-permanent contract. My understanding is the only way they got Stephen Hawking's who just passed away, to be justified under this system is that he wrote a lot of books that sold well. We're seeing similar things actually at the National Science Foundation and NIH. When I was at NSF, I was the program officer for STAR Metrics, which was trying to figure out the return on investment of federal investments in research and development. It's now grown, morphed in some ways. The Office of Integrated Activities just got a huge amount of funding for something they're calling convergence. And my understanding is that they're trying to figure out how to get research converted into patents that then lead to economic development. That's great unless you're actually trying to help a community solve its problem. There's an awful lot of the social sciences that this patent doesn't make any sense. It's not you can't patent an idea. So we want these researchers to come up with great ideas, but if they're not patentable, it's not valuable. This is a system that's in serious misalignment. On the other side, we see an increase in citizen engagement. And of course, there's danger in that, although it turns out Congress, they're citizens as well, and they are engaged in what you can spend your money on. We saw a student walkout yesterday. These students, equipped with cell phones, videotaped the attack in their school. Those videos had an enormous impact. They had grassroots fundraising, millions of dollars. They're mobilized, they're unhappy, and I'm hopeful we might start seeing a lifting of the embargo on federally funded research on gun violence. The Pennsylvania 18th election yesterday shows that we may be seeing a sea change in terms of the political activism, the political engagement. These are enormous opportunities for engaged scholarship. We're seeing a real change with ordinary people getting involved, with tenure really under siege, with a society that wants us to solve problems. This is a phenomenal rearrangement, realignment of interests within this innovation ecosystem. I think our opportunities are really only limited by our ability to answer the question, how do we step up? How do we do this?
Do we have a secondary mic back here? Cole. I'm very loud.
Testing.
That's never been an issue.
You're not loud enough for YouTube.
Not loud enough for you?
For YouTube.
Oh, YouTube?
I'm so lucky in the early part of my career, YouTube wasn't around. I guess a lot of people feel the same way. What we want to do is open it up for questions from the floor, if you have any. Oh, sure, right here. If not, I have plenty of this. Not an issue.
Thank you very much for great presentations. I have a question for all of you. I'm teaching research ethics at Colorado School of Mines. Most of my students are actually from two fields that have not been represented in the literature. The two fields are artificial intelligence and geosciences. So I was wondering if you could provide some guidance on what standards or guidelines, policies I can share with my students from the two fields.
I'm not aware of any professional codes of ethics in those fields. I'm not as familiar with those fields. I am aware of some really very interesting ethical problems in those areas. And we can talk about them. I mean, the whole issue of climate change and trying to, do some engineering to try to mitigate climate change, that's a huge issue. Is how you might use engineering to deal with that problem. Obviously, artificial intelligence and all the problems with that creates, self-driving vehicles, things like that. But I'm not aware of, codes. There's a question back here. You're raising your hand, Joe. You're aware of some codes?
Yeah.
Not so much in geosciences, but in artificial intelligence, there's been a lot of attention
Brought to bear.
Grab the mic. IEEE, the largest professional society in the world, has actually taken a great deal of interest in artificial intelligence, and they have a global initiative on ethics in artificial intelligence. They're also trying to introduce ethical issues into their standards operations. And a recent revision to the IEEE Code of Ethics that directly addresses things like design for ethics and intelligent systems. For people who've been involved in IEEE for a long time, this is kind of remarkable that this has all come to pass so rapidly. There's also a working group of engineers and computer scientists that was led by Keith Miller, who's at the University of Missouri St. Louis, who worked on what we call the 5 rules for computing professionals who were working on intelligent and autonomous systems. And I can provide anyone with details on that as well. So in AI, there are resources out there. Geosciences I'm not as familiar with.
I'm not specifically familiar with it, but I look at the AGU, the American Geophysical Union, because that's the organizing association for people who are doing geosciences.
To change the subject abruptly to engagement, and particularly public engagement. I've spent a little bit of my time following public engagement with respect to, let me use the term, GMOs. And this has been going on. This country, I guess, a lot of public engagement in Europe. The European community was earlier. And as a geneticist, I'm concerned that often the public engagement is ill-informed. And I'm wondering, do we have some creative suggestions as to how to guide the public engagement into being better informed engagement?
Could you say a little bit more about why it would be ill-informed, public engagement?
Okay, because, well, a little bit hard for me to say. People get outraged if something's labeled GMOs. Let me give a little different example. I saw bottles of water, plastic bottles of water in the refrigeration cases labeled organic water. Does anybody know what organic means in science? It means it has carbon molecules in it, right? H2O can't be organic, but people get on this bandwagon. Basically, I'll claim that all crops that we use are modified from their, genetically modified from their original wild ancestors. Some of them by natural means, some of them by farmers in the early ages, 20,000 years ago, some of them by radiation. On this campus, we had a nuclear reactor. We would irradiate peanuts and select the mutations that appeared to be best. Those aren't genetically modified, so claims a lot of people. It's only when you use modern techniques. So I think what happens is people get on a bandwagon, get outraged. That's my guess. And And once they're outraged, logic and information goes by the side, and the engagement does things like, we cannot have yellow rice produced in the third world because it's modified. On the other hand, it will save lots and lots of children's sight. So that's my speculation. I am not, my expertise is not in the social sciences as to how the public reacts, but I'm telling you what I see.
Thank you.
So one of the interesting things I've been following, Pew actually does a worldwide survey of trust in institutions. And this past year was the first year they saw it drop across all institutions. So people don't trust their government. People don't trust corporations. People don't trust the police. People don't trust journalists. Interestingly, the only group that they still do trust is libraries. It's good. I'm at a College of Information Studies. We have librarians. I'm not sure why they still trust libraries. Maybe because there's no money involved. We're seeing corporate engagement in the creation of K-12 curriculum, pushing a particular view. This is one of the issues in the geosciences is, you know, you have the oil exploration companies writing their geoscience curriculum. Does that actually slant the message that's going forward? I think public engagement is a real challenge in this environment because the public no longer trusts most of the major institutions. And the first question they're going to be asking is, it's a deep throat question, who's making money off of this? Where's the money? Where are the interests that are lining up? And I think this is a real opportunity for engaged scholarship because what we're teaching the students, as Dean was saying yesterday, is how to investigate something and follow their interests and assess the quality of the information and come to their own conclusions. I do think the public engagement in GMO was botched. And I think that this actually is a strong argument for early community and public engagement because you can't recover from this now. This is a real problem. People don't trust GMO. It's going to be decades if they ever trust GMO. If GMO were a corporation, they'd have to actually declare bankruptcy and come out of it with a different name, like Hooker Chemicals did after the Love Canal and then became Occidental Chemicals. They could not walk away from that.
Let me just speak to some examples of recent public engagement in GMOs. So I guess you're familiar with genetically modified mosquitoes to try to prevent dengue fever and maybe someday malaria and Zika and things like that. Well, there have been different attempts at public engagement, some less successful and some more successful. So a successful model was, it has been done in South American countries where the population was much more receptive to introduction of the mosquitoes into their environments. And one thing that was really interesting is that the community engagement effort really, it was very thorough, okay? There was people going door to door actually in these kind of community engagement efforts to really have, you know, open discussions with people about their concerns and forums, public forums and all this. Now, this also happened down in Florida recently where, you know, communities had to approve the mosquitoes, and it was interesting, the Florida example, you know, there'd already been the FDA, you know, approval for the mosquitoes, but there's still, and the state of Florida had voted in favor of them, but the local communities still had to sign off on it. And what's interesting is that initially there was some positive response because they were very concerned about, you know, mosquito-borne diseases locally and trying to infect them. But what happened was a lot of people that did not live in the community, stakeholders, environmental organizations, things like that, had started to have an impact, and special interests started to have an impact on the local community and its decision-making process. So what that shows to me is that because of this it's a global society that we live in with the internet and everything else, what you have is you have groups that have interests all over the globe, so that this particular, it's almost like, you know, the Cold War, when you know, Russia and the United States would go and get involved in different countries. What we have now is actually, I think, we have, you know, environmental groups that see their interests not as global, and so they're going to fight their battles, whether it's going to be in some county in Florida or wherever it's going to be, to try to oppose GMOs or whatever they do. So I think what you have to realize now is that community engagement no longer just involves talking to local people, but it actually involves having to come to terms with the fact of this sort of global society we live in, and all these different groups that can start to influence the way people feel and the decisions they make, and how do you engage those groups in the whole process. Thanks.
I want to add something. I'm writing a book on Zika. So I've been doing a lot of research over the last few years on this subject. Some information for you. The first thing is we did a study back a few years ago. It was done by the NSF on intuitive toxicology. It mostly dealt with nanoscience, and we collected data on something called organic engagement, involved people if they have carbon. So, but the organic engagement article is out, and what it argues is that if you go and engage the public where the public already meets, like a natural location, what ends up happening is you tend to have more ecological validity as you enter into that setting, and you tend to have a superior engagement phenomenon in that organic sense rather than that inorganic sense. The second issue we just mentioned is this NIMBY issue, where you have a bunch of white folks in Key Haven going, yeah, we don't care about these mosquitoes. We don't get dengue, right? But it's not an issue here. And you've got an activity where you've got these folks making decisions on where research is going to take place. And when I was writing the book, I have a whole chapter called Genetic Inflation, which is that the public just cannot distinguish between different approaches to variation. They just can't do it. They don't have the tools to do it, nor are they interested in developing the tool sets to do it. And what you had done in South America was you actually had organic engagement, right? These people went to their homes, went to their churches, right? This is where it all took place. And so it was a very interesting approach, and is consistent with, you know, and some of the research that's been done. But I've been doing this nano engagement thing for too long, like a quarter of a century, right? And I wrote a book called NanoHype on it. The thing is, the problem we've always had with engagement is assessment. That's been the big problem. We've had a lot of engagement activities, many of which are so poorly assessed that it's really difficult to make the argument that we should do it again, or that the government should invest the time and energy to do it. And I've reviewed so many NSF proposals where you get to the engagement extension, broader impact, and you're like, what? Like, what do you get? And the reason is you don't get very much unless you have an assessment system, and people really haven't figured out how to do that. That's my 2 cents.
There you go.
Hello. Susan, you mentioned a little bit about convergent research and how it's one of NSF's big fundable ideas. And so a little bit on convergent research is you have these academic partners, your industry partners, government, and you have this global partners where you solve complex problems. But the biggest thing that's missing is this community engagement piece, this ethical piece. What are your thoughts on using behavior science as a way to assess? So, for example, I'm integrating a little bit of behavioral science in my research, and we're using functional near-infrared spectroscopy to measure brain frequencies to try to validate why it's important to have community engagement a part of this convergent research.
I think there are some interesting models out there, and certainly I've been we've all been living through the big data hype, and I can call it hype. I've seen it on the Gartner hype curve, where there's all this data. If we just had all the data, we would know the answer. And then we get all the data and we analyze it and realize the data was awful. It didn't actually speak to the question that we had. We don't know if any of this is reliable or valid. What does this number mean? How is it different from this other number? Nobody put in the metadata. We don't have the documentation on this. It turns out the measuring system changed. The social scientists have a lot to bring to the table, just in terms of thinking about evaluation, certainly. But we're also seeing, I'm seeing some really interesting models of community engagement that does include some quantitative and good qualitative data. There was something in the paper yesterday. They did a nice pilot where they sent pharmacists out to barber shops. Yes, pharmacists out to barber shops, where they did a quick screening on blood pressure. And the barber shops where they didn't send a pharmacist, but they just did blood pressure readings, people did lower their blood pressure by like 9%. But when they sent a pharmacist who actually explained the results and explained what you could do, they lowered blood pressure by 33%. I mean, this was just remarkable for people who have high blood pressure. I'm amazed at what public health does in terms of community outreach and engagement. There is a public health officer in every county and every state by law. Agriculture, we've got the ag extension. There's an ag extension agent in every county and every state in the United States by law. I'm amazed at how little we do with the public libraries in terms of extension. I've actually got a project I'm working on now. We're doing knowledge extension to try and bring business intelligence and analytics into public libraries. There are built-in networks by which you can actually engage people. But part of it takes thinking about what that infrastructure looks like and who you need to bring to the table to be able to do this. Groups like agriculture and public health that have an extension mandate, particularly at the land-grant colleges, have thought through ways of doing this. We're seeing public library systems putting social workers in the library because that's where people come who are in need. And they're not going to walk into a social work clinic. So where do you find these people? How do you engage them? Finding them where they already are, I think, is enormously powerful. But having a way of speaking to the policymakers that provides numbers. Education has been struggling with this. How do you actually evaluate the abilities in K through 12 education? They've got some very strong methodologists there that could be helpful. So I think you're right, a strong partnership where you can speak the language of policymakers, provide the evidence that they're hoping for, or argue with them why that evidence is not appropriate. One of the task forces I was on when I was at NSF, the Office of Program Management, decided that all research had to meet the gold standard. All education research had to meet the gold standard of medicine. It had to be double blind. So as a student, then, you couldn't know if you were learning phonics. This makes no sense, right? So it took NSF several years to actually make the case that no, there's a lot of education research that can't follow the medical model. That was very hard policy work, but it did come up with, we finally created a document that the Department of Education, the National Science Foundation, and OPM were comfortable going forward with in terms of evaluating education programs. So the policy work is not necessarily easy, but you can actually create standards and documentation that people can then build toward. But yeah, you're right, you need to bring into the partnership people who know how to do organic engagement and know how to do evaluation and provide the evidence in a way that the decision makers can understand it.
I'm loving all of this talk about social sciences. Keep doing it. And I'll say a couple of things. So one, mentioned about this idea of organic engagement, and I am also struck by kind of broader impacts, which speaks to measurable outcomes in a finite time. The challenge of engagement, community engagement, is often it takes time, right? And it involves involving people from the generation of the research questions all the way through the data analysis and the evaluation and assessment. And organic engagement oftentimes is messy. So one of the projects we were proposing, working with toxicologists, soil scientists, focusing on heavy metals in an environment in a lower income community in Durham, the proposal required community-based participatory engagement. And we added, in my area, community-based participatory action research, right? So in other words, what comes out of this from the community's perspective, you have no idea, right? So while the community was very interested in getting these heavy metals out of their environment, issues of trust were a huge part of not just their relationship, less with the university or researchers and more with government, and the historical dimensions of how those communities have been treated, the economic dimensions to all of this for those community folk. So while they were very much interested in the science of it and wanted to learn that, in the long run, it was about really social and political change and social justice, as was mentioned, that also had to be in the mix. The last thing I'll say about it, as we work more interdisciplinarily, one of the things, the challenges that I have experienced is oftentimes how we are thinking about this idea of engagement is not necessarily the same. So that organic piece where you have to trust what comes from the community is often, it's hard to reach that. And what we found necessary is to sit down at the very beginning as we're doing this interdisciplinary work, to talk about values, to talk about principles of engagement as we move forward to do this work. Because if we don't do that at the very beginning, when we get to the end, we're still kind of thinking about it differently.
Questions? Here.
I was wondering if we could revisit one of the things that Susan said that struck me as being maybe a little paradoxical. On the one hand, we've got a public which is increasingly looking to academics to solve problems. On the other hand, we've got the elected representatives of the public cutting funding and, in many cases, eliminating tenure. So what do we do with this tension, and how do they interact? Sorry for the easy question.
No, that's, before this panel, we were asked to send our remarks and some possible questions, and so I wrote my remarks and I couldn't think of any questions, so I took my laptop down the hall and stopped some of our staff members and students and said, if I said this, what would your questions be? And it kind of came up with one of those. So what does this mean when you've got a desire to solve problems but no trust in government, but you've got the government funding? And by the way, corporate money to R&D is actually dropping as well. So it's not like industry is stepping up and funding the research that Congress is not funding. I wish I could make the world run the way I want it to run. I think politics, policy, and government are messy. I think that we have a tendency to it works sort of as a pendulum, and I think that realizing I graduated high school when Proposition 13 passed in California, and basically it was the beginning of the taxpayer revolt. It was 1977. So we've been 40 years of starving the budgets for states and starving the tax funds for the federal government. We've really seen a realignment. I think now at 40 years, I remember my favorite analogy was somebody saying, yes, you know, you can have the grocery stores disappear and you can still make some pretty good meals out of what's left in your refrigerator and your pantry, but eventually you've got to restock the pantry. And I think at 40 years after the taxpayer revolt, we're realizing that the bridges are crumbling, the roads are crumbling, the states can't support this. We're seeing that the teachers go on strike in West Virginia. I think the pendulum is actually kind of getting to one far out end, and I think we're going to see it swinging back. I'm not sure what that realignment is going to look like. It's probably not going to be anything we've seen before. They say history doesn't repeat itself, but it does tend to rhyme. It'll be different, but I think people are kind of getting to the end of the ideological, logical conclusion. If you follow this ideology, here's where it takes you. And I think we're starting to see that where it's taking us is not where we want to go.
Let me just put a little historical perspective on this whole funding of research question. I mean, if you go back to you know, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, there was no funding of research, hardly at all, right? We had independent researchers doing, you know, who funded Galileo? I don't think anybody funded Galileo, right? But he still managed to do some good research.
They had private patrons.
Right. And that's the way it was. Really, it was mostly private money funding. There was some government money. I mean, Newton was funded to do research on ballistics and cannons and things like that. But it mostly was private money until World War II. And then we started, of course, and it was all military driven in World War II. But even then, it really didn't ramp up to the levels we saw during the Cold War with Sputnik. You remember that. That was a major driver in terms of investment in science and technology in the United States. And after Sputnik, there was tremendous investment in universities and science and technology, research and all that in the United States, to where more than 50% of R&D was funded by the government, going into the 70s. But then we had a drop off to where today, I think by most estimates, about 2/3 of R&D is funded by industry. And we're seeing that, you know, so I think what's going to have to happen, I think, is that we're going to have to figure out a way to do, you know, good research with decreasing government funds. I don't see the government funding is going to the way it was back in the heyday of the Cold War, when, you know, we were worried about, you know, keeping up with the Soviets with our science. I just don't see it happening that way, and it's gonna, I think it's gonna have to be some, you know, cooperation between private industry and academia and government to get research done.
So grab the mic. Mitch has had his hand up for a while.
Okay, let's hear from Mitch, and this will be the last question.
All right, so as Craig was talking about broader impacts, I started thinking about the ways that broader impacts are often communicated in NSF proposals, and I realized that they tend to be very much about the positive, or the potentially positive broader impacts. It seems that a lot of the research funding mechanisms, and kind of as Susan was saying, thinking about what's patentable, there's a lot of incentives for researchers to be very exuberant about the potential positive impacts of their work. When you think about like who's checking the negative impacts, I mean, my mind as a social science researcher goes automatically to institutional review boards. but those are only for human subjects research. And kind of as a result, they also only focus on individual impacts to individuals who are participating. So it seems that generally scientists have to trust that the systems around them that are funding them or that are employing them are going to be paying attention to the potential negative impacts because they have very little reason to do so. This is concerning. So my question is, what systems do we have in place to actually anticipate potential massive problems that our research could create beyond just trusting that the ethicists will figure it out for us? And how could the system be reconfigured to incorporate that sort of anticipation more?
It's a tough question, Ms. Shai. Sorry now that I asked you to ask it.
Well, I think I'm a little bit familiar with research regulation. I mean, the IRB example is a very good example because actually in the federal regulations it instructs IRBs to, when they're assessing risks, to only look at the risks to human subjects and not to look at the long-term risks of application of policy. So in the regulations, they knew that they didn't want IRBs to get in the middle of these very difficult political issues with research. So they said just focus on the human subjects. Now, if you look at pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, medical devices, pesticides, agriculture, pollution, on and on. You know, we have ways of regulating these things, and we have really good risk assessment people looking at risks, right? Public health, environmental, and so forth. But this kind of risk assessment tends to be micro level in the sense that we're looking at the risk of a particular chemical or a particular pharmaceutical, right? We're not looking at the risk of, say, the biotechnology industry in general, right? We're just not, you know, equipped to look at those sort of macro level risks, and I don't know if there's any way you can really do it. I mean, legally, I mean, it just gets to be too vague, and it's not even something that might work as a legal mechanism. It seems to only really work when we have these sort of little tiny issues we can put our fingers on to figure out what risk and, you know, the risks and benefits are.
Let's thank our panel. So I think I'll work from down